Okay, before we transition to Gilgamesh and talk about epic poetry, I want to give one just really brief, one more short little video before we get to the meat, the main part of the lesson with Gilgamesh. So, along with Gilgamesh, I also assigned from the textbook, a section called Ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern Literature. And so what this is about 20 pages of the book that's devoted to introducing you to the time period we're about to study. As I mentioned before, this course covers antiquity through the fall of the Roman Empire. And by antiquity, that just means a really long time ago. We're basically going from the beginning of time as we know it as humans to the fall of the Roman Empire. And so the period before the birth of Christ and really a little bit after the birth of Christ until what we know as the Middle Ages, which is the first period students study in the class after this one, Humanities 211. That's referred to as antiquity, which just means a really long time ago. And so this introduction from the book that I'm going to cover in this short video is basically an overview of the big historical events going on during antiquity, and then the literary themes in the works they appear in, the themes that correspond to the events going on during that time. And so I just want to take about 5 minutes and real quickly go over that reading because it's a lot to absorb. And so I don't want to just repeat what you covered in the reading, but rather hit the highlights, explain to you what is most important to retain from that reading, because this reading is really important. It will inform Gilgamesh and the other texts we read going forward. It will give us some really important background. And so that's what we're going to do here on this next slide. I chose this slide with this image because what it shows is trade routes. So you can see the Roman trade network and other ones here, and trading was really important. That was how people exchanged goods, and they were, certain areas or certain regions would produce certain items, and then they would need something from another region that didn't grow or exist where they lived. So they would travel around and they would meet with other people, and they would exchange things they had for things they didn't have. And that was how it worked. But this whole concept of trading and trade routes is really important to the rise and the development of the literature at that time, which you'll see in just a second. So here are some of the important themes from the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern literature we're studying. One thing to keep in mind is that literature at that time was an oral tradition. So things like the Iliad and the Odyssey that we're going to read very soon in the next few lessons, those were spoken aloud, is what that word oral means, before they were written down. And so this persisted for thousands of years because the concept of writing is actually relatively new in terms of a technological standpoint, in terms of inventing paper and being able to write something down. That's a relatively new concept. And Homer, who eventually wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey, was one of the first to do it. But those stories, Gilgamesh was the very first, but those stories were told aloud for years. Like I said, centuries really before he wrote them down. And so there's certain things about the structure, like we'll talk about this more in the next video where we talk about epic poetry, but something like Gilgamesh or the Iliad or the Odyssey reads more like a novel than a poem to modern readers because it tells a narrative, it tells a story, and we don't typically think of poems being really long and telling a story. But the reason it was poetic was people had to remember the story. And so there's certain repetitions, or if we were reading these things in the actual Greek or the actual Sumerian rather than a translation, we'd see more of the poetic structure and how they rhyme and how they're like a poem. But the reason they would take a narrative, a story, and put it in poetic form is so they could remember to tell it out loud. And these are the earliest stories. This is how they were told. I've used the binging Netflix metaphor a lot but it's the same idea. People have always wanted to hear stories. There's something about human nature, the way we're made, that we just crave narrative. We want to be enthralled by an adventure that's suspenseful and find out what happens next. And so before we had Netflix, before we had novels, before the printing press was invented, before we even truly had paper, people would tell them out loud. And so most cultures that are really old cultures, that go back a long time, have an oral tradition. We don't have that here in the United States because we're only a couple hundred years old, and we became a country at the time the novel was being invented. But if you go back to cultures, say, for instance, like the Native American culture, that has a much longer history, that's been around a much longer, they have an oral tradition, just as the Greeks and the Romans and the other cultures we're studying in this class too. So it's important when we read things like the Iliad and the Odyssey to know they came from this oral tradition, and that informs some of the structure of the poetic work. And another thing we're looking at here is the origins of language and literature, because we're looking at the development of Western civilization. So you can't have literature without language. So how did language come about? The earliest documents that are actually written down are administrative lists, but we wouldn't really call administrative lists literature, right? So the first piece of literature that was written down, and here I'm using the definition of literature as tells a story, tells a narrative, is Gilgamesh. If people looking back at older pieces of writing are trying to define things, they probably wouldn't define an administrative list as literature. But Gilgamesh, the way it tells a story and we follow the hero's adventure and we care about him as a protagonist and we see how he learns and grows and accomplishes different things and faces different trials and feats, that we would think of as literature. And so in terms of the earliest things, longest ago, actually written down, Gilgamesh is the oldest one in terms of when it was written down, that we would think of as literature in terms of the genre, the way we define it. And it was written down in cuneiform, which is basically an ancient form of writing, very similar to hieroglyphics. Gilgamesh is an epic poem, just like the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid. Most of the things we'll read are epic poems because it's the oldest genre, and we're studying the oldest literature in this class. So on the next video, we'll learn about epic poetry and what it is. The Phoenician script, the Phoenician language, is the oldest surviving ancient writing system. And so the cuneiform, which I said was like hieroglyphics that Gilgamesh was written in, that didn't really survive in terms of the word I'm using there, survival. So what I mean by that, by that word survival, I mean when we look at language today, we can still see traces, connections, the influence of that previous language. So when we look at the English language today, we can actually see traces of Phoenician script in it. And I'll explain how that works in a minute. But if you look at the languages being spoken in the world today, you don't really see cuneiform. So the Phoenician script came along in this part of the world after the Phoenician script. And as I said, through trade, it eventually spread all over the Mediterranean. So you think about that image I had on that first slide and why I had that there. You have people living in one part of the world. They produce grain there. Then there's another part of the world not too far away, somewhere else along the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean is this body of water that flows and intersects all these lands that have some other product that particular region does not have. They sail there, they exchange those things. But they don't just exchange things in that goods, and that's it. They also talk, they get together, they hang out. And so these oral stories, they probably tell some of those aloud. They're probably, hanging out around the fire, having a few drinks and some foods after they exchange their goods, and they start telling these stories. And so stories, like the ones we read in this class, spread all around the Mediterranean during this time. And that's why you'll see similar common elements. For instance, if you've read Gilgamesh for homework before this lecture, then you'll know there's a flood story. And if you grew up in the West where there's a strong Judeo-Christian tradition, you probably have heard of the flood story of Noah from the Bible. So why would those similar flood stories show up in two fairly different texts from different regions? Well, both the Hebrew region and the Mesopotamian region Gilgamesh came from were on the Mediterranean. And so people probably traveled along and traded stories, and that's how you see two similar flood stories and two different tales. And so language would then spread too. So the Phoenician language, just like the story, spread throughout the Mediterranean. And eventually it reached Greek. Now, one thing you'll notice about Phoenician language, if you ever look at it, is it doesn't have vowels. And if you know anything about the English language, vowels are pretty important. So the Greeks, once the Phoenician language spread throughout the Mediterranean via trade and reached Greece, the Greeks basically took it and adopted it for their own language. And the Phoenician language was a source of the Greek language, but the Greeks added vowels and made it their own, and it became Greek rather than Phoenician once the Greeks added vowels. So that was an important step. In language, continues to spread like that. And so the way I say it's the oldest surviving language is you can trace that connection where eventually Greek influenced Latin, and Latin, as we'll learn about later in the course, is the most influential language because many languages today, like French, Spanish, German, and English, are all Latinate languages, meaning they are influenced by Latin. And we can trace that influence all the way back to the Phoenician script and see kind of the transition, the handing off over here to the Greeks and then to Latin. So just some background on how language came about and how stories were passed around in the oral tradition throughout the Mediterranean, because that is a source of most of what we're reading. And so this is just some helpful background to launch us into our study. Now, on the next video, we'll finally talk about Gilgamesh.